The mountain pass was treacherous even in good weather, but during the late autumn storms that swept through the Dragon's Spine range, it became a death trap for anyone foolish enough to attempt the crossing. I was one of those fools, driven by desperation rather than wisdom, carrying medical supplies to the isolated village of Winterhaven, where a fever outbreak was claiming lives faster than the local healers could manage. My name is Elena Stormweaver, a traveling healer who had spent the last 5 years wandering the Northern Territories and offering aid to those who couldn't afford the expensive physicians that served the wealthy cities. At 24, I had seen more suffering than most people encountered in lifetimes, but nothing could have prepared me for what I would find huddled beneath that outcropping of ice-covered stone. The storm had forced me to seek shelter among the rocks, my supplies packed tight against the wind that threatened to tear them from my back when I heard it. A sound so faint and pitiful that I almost dismissed it as imagination playing tricks in the howling gale. But there it was again, a weak chirping that spoke of something young and frightened and very close to death. Following the sound through sheets of freezing rain that turned my cloak into a useless burden, I discovered a creature that made my breath catch despite the cold that stole warmth from my lungs with every gasp. It was a dragon hatchling, no bigger than a large cat, with scales that should have gleamed like polished obsidian, but were dulled by illness and injury. One of its wings hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and its breathing was so shallow I could barely detect the rise and fall of its small chest. Dragons were legendary creatures that most humans went their entire lives without seeing, beings of immense power that lived in isolation from mortal affairs. And here was one dying alone in a storm, with no parent or protector in sight. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to leave it and continue to shelter, to preserve my own resources rather than waste them on a creature that probably couldn't be saved and whose death would cost me nothing personally. But I had become a healer precisely because I couldn't ignore suffering when I encountered it, couldn't walk past creatures in need just because helping them was inconvenient or dangerous. So instead of seeking safety, I gathered the dying hatchling into my arms, wrapped it in my warmest blanket, and began the careful work of assessing injuries that went far beyond the broken wing. The little dragon was burning with fever, its scales hot enough to make my hands ache from prolonged contact, and when I carefully examined its body, I found puncture wounds that suggested it had been attacked by something with teeth designed to pierce dragon hide. These weren't accidental injuries from a fall or natural disaster, but the deliberate wounds of a predator that had seen a vulnerable youngster and seized the opportunity. Using what little magic I possessed, I channeled healing energy into the small body cradled against my chest, working to reduce the fever and close the worst of the puncture wounds before they could become fatally infected. My healing abilities were modest compared to the great physicians who served in royal courts, limited to accelerating natural healing processes rather than performing miraculous cures. But for minor injuries and illnesses, they were usually sufficient to mean the difference between survival and death. As I worked through the night in that ice-covered shelter, the storm raging beyond our small protected space, the hatchling began to show signs of improvement. Its breathing became stronger, more regular, and the burning heat of fever began to recede to more normal temperatures. When dawn finally broke and the storm began to clear, I found myself looking into eyes that swirled with colors I had never seen before. Intelligence that seemed far too profound for something so young, and gratitude that was unmistakable despite the lack of shared language. The little dragon made soft, chirping sounds and attempted to nuzzle against my hand with the trust that only very young creatures showed toward those, and I felt my heart melting despite the practical concerns about what I was supposed to do with a dragon hatchling that clearly couldn't survive on its own yet. The broken wing alone would take weeks to heal properly, during which time the youngster would be unable to fly or hunt or protect itself from the dangers that lurked in these mountains. Taking it with me to Winterhaven seemed impossible, since dragons were feared by most humans who saw them as dangerous predators. But leaving it here to fend for itself would be a death sentence, given its injuries and vulnerability. The decision was made for me when the hatchling attempted to follow as I gathered my supplies to continue my journey, limping along on 3 legs while the broken wing dragged uselessly behind it, calling out with pitiful sounds that made continuing without it feel like the cruelest abandonment. So I fashioned a sling from spare cloth, secured the little dragon against my chest where it could stay warm and protected, and resumed my trek toward Winterhaven with a companion I had never expected, and complications I couldn't begin to predict. The village greeted me with relief that quickly turned to shock when they realized I was carrying a dragon. But the fever outbreak was severe enough that they were willing to overlook my unusual traveling companion in exchange for the medical expertise and supplies I provided. Over the following weeks, I treated the sick while the hatchling recovered in a small room the village elder had grudgingly provided, its broken wing carefully splintered and healing with the resilience that marked all draconic creatures. The little one, whom I had taken to calling Ember for the way its scales seemed to glow with inner fire when it was happy or excited, proved to be far more intelligent than I had expected, learning to understand simple commands and even attempting to help with my healing work by providing warmth to patients who were dangerously cold. It was during the 4th week of our stay in Winterhaven that everything changed. I was working in the makeshift clinic I had established in the village common house when the air itself seemed to freeze, every person in the room going completely still as an oppressive presence descended over the entire settlement. Through the windows, I could see shadows darkening the afternoon sky, massive shapes that blotted out the sun with wingspans that dwarfed the buildings below. And I knew with terrible certainty that adult dragons had arrived and were circling the village with intentions I could only guess at. The villagers began to panic, mothers gathering children and men reaching for weapons that would be utterly useless against creatures who could incinerate entire armies with their breath. While I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to understand what had brought such powerful beings to our remote location. The answer became clear when Ember, who had been napping peacefully in the corner of the clinic, suddenly perked up and began making excited chirping sounds that seemed to resonate with the massive roars echoing from the sky above. These dragons weren't here to attack or conquer, but were searching for something precious they had lost, and somehow I knew with absolute certainty that they were looking for the hatchling I had saved from death in the mountain pass. The largest of the dragons landed in the village square with earth-shaking force, its scales gleaming like polished midnight and its eyes burning with intelligence and barely controlled fury as it surveyed the terrified humans who had frozen in place. When it spoke, the sound was like thunder given voice, carrying authority that had been earned over centuries of existence and power that could reshape landscapes with casual thought. "Humans," it said in a language I somehow understood, despite never having learned draconic speech, "we seek a youngling who was lost in the mountain storms 4 weeks past. Any who have information about my son's whereabouts will be rewarded beyond imagining. Any who have harmed him will face destruction so complete that even memory of their existence will be burned from reality itself." The threat was clear and absolute, spoken by a being whose power made human concepts of justice or mercy seem laughably inadequate, and I knew in that moment that I had to reveal Ember's presence before the dragon's patience ran out and the entire village paid the price for my decision to help an injured hatchling. Stepping forward, despite legs that trembled with primal fear in the presence of such overwhelming supernatural power, I called out in a voice that shook but remained clear enough to carry across the square where the massive dragon waited for response. "Great One," I said, using honorifics that felt appropriate even though I had no training in how to address draconic royalty. I believe I may have information about your son, though I did not know his identity when I found him dying in the mountain pass. The effect of my words was immediate and electric, the dragon's burning gaze fixing on me with intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness of just how fragile human flesh was compared to the forces this being could command. Before the great dragon could respond, Ember came tumbling out of the clinic with the clumsy enthusiasm that marked all youngsters, his broken wing now splinted but healing, making the same excited chirping sounds that had marked his recognition of the dragons circling overhead. The reunion between father and son was simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful, the massive dragon carefully lowering his enormous head to nuzzle the tiny hatchling with gentleness that belied his earlier threats, while Ember chirped and trilled with obvious joy at being reunited with family he must have feared he would never see again. For several minutes the two dragons communed in their own language, a series of sounds and gestures that conveyed far more meaning than words alone could manage, while I stood awkwardly to the side, wondering if I should attempt to leave or if that would be interpreted as hostile action by beings who could end my existence with casual thought. Finally, the great dragon turned his attention back to me, his expression having shifted from barely controlled fury to something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with curiosity about the human who had dared to help his son. "You are the one who saved Theron," he said, and I realized with shock that he was using my language now, speaking with an accent that suggested he had spent time among humans and learned our ways. "My son has told me how you found him dying from wounds inflicted by sky hunters, how you used your healing magic to draw him back from death's door, despite having no obligation to do so, how you protected him during his recovery when abandoning him would have been safer and more practical." The dragon paused, his massive form shifting slightly as if uncertain how to proceed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried notes of emotion that seemed almost painful for such a powerful being to express. "I am Valdris Stormwing, Dragon Prince of the Northern Ares, ruler of territories that span 3 mountain ranges and protector of the ancient compact between dragons and the other races that share our world. 4 weeks ago, my only son was stolen from our nesting grounds by enemies who sought to destroy my bloodline, and I have spent every moment since searching for him, with growing certainty that I would find only his bones." The words hit me like physical blows, as I began to understand the magnitude of what had happened, the political implications of the creature I had casually taken under my protection without understanding his importance, or the enemies that had sought his death. Dragon Prince Valdris continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as he processed relief that was clearly overwhelming even for someone of his power and experience. "You have returned to me the most precious thing in my existence, healer. You have proven that honor and compassion still exist among your kind, despite centuries of misunderstanding and conflict between our peoples. For this service, I am in your debt in ways that cannot be repaid with mere gold or territory or promises of protection." The declaration sent whispers rippling through the assembled villagers, who were beginning to understand that the terrifying dragon who had descended on their settlement had come not as enemy, but as grateful father, seeking to thank the human who had saved his child. But I barely heard their reactions, too focused on processing the fact that Ember, whose trusting presence had become a comfort during long nights of treating the sick, was actually Theron, heir to one of the most powerful dragon bloodlines in existence, whose death would have sparked conflicts that could have reshaped the political landscape of entire kingdoms. "Great Prince," I said carefully, aware that every word mattered when speaking to beings whose power made them accustomed to absolute deference, "I require no payment or reward for helping Theron. I did what any healer would do when confronted with a creature in desperate need of aid, and I'm grateful that I was able to make a difference in his recovery." The words were meant to be gracious, to deflect attention from actions that had simply felt right rather than heroic, But Dragon Prince Valdris responded with laughter that shook the very stones beneath our feet and sent birds fleeing from trees for miles around. "No payment required," he repeated with amusement that was somehow not mocking, but genuinely delighted by my response. Spoken like someone who has no understanding of what debt means to dragonkind, or how seriously we take obligations of honor. He settled his massive bulk more comfortably in the square, apparently prepared to remain until he had said everything he needed to say, while Theron curled up against his father's foreleg with contentment that was heart-warming to witness. Among dragons, life debts are sacred obligations that transcend politics or personal preference, Valdris explained, with the patience of someone accustomed to teaching important concepts to those who lacked proper understanding. "You saved my son's life, healer, which means you have earned the eternal protection of my bloodline and the friendship of someone whose alliance can reshape your destiny in ways you cannot yet imagine." The implications were staggering, suggesting that my simple act of compassion had somehow bound me to draconic politics and power structures I knew nothing about. But before I could formulate a response that wouldn't sound either ungrateful or terrified, Valdris continued with an offer that would change the trajectory of my entire existence. "I have a proposal for you, Elena Stormweaver, one that I hope you will consider carefully before responding. My son has told me that you possess healing abilities beyond the ordinary, that your magic works through love and genuine care rather than mere technical skill. He has also informed me that during his recovery you showed him nothing but kindness, despite having no reason to trust a dragon or invest energy in his survival." The Dragon Prince paused, his burning gaze holding mine with intensity that made looking away feel impossible, even as every instinct screamed at me to show proper submission. "The dragon territories have need of healers who can work with our young, who understand that power without compassion becomes tyranny, and that true strength shows itself through protecting the vulnerable rather than dominating them. I invite you to join my household as royal healer and tutor to my son, to help him understand the races he will someday need to work with, and to serve as bridge between draconic and human understanding." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, promising opportunities beyond anything a traveling healer from modest origins could normally hope to achieve, but also carrying complications and dangers I could barely begin to imagine. Life in a dragon's household would mean leaving behind the familiar routines and simple joys that had defined my existence, adapting to customs and power dynamics I didn't understand, and shouldering responsibilities that felt overwhelming for someone whose greatest aspiration had been to heal village children and help farmers through difficult winters. But looking at Theron, whose scales had regained their healthy shine during our weeks together, whose broken wing was healing thanks to careful treatment, and who clearly adored the human who had shown him nothing but gentleness when he was most vulnerable, I realized that this decision had been made the moment I chose to shelter a dying hatchling instead of preserving my own resources and comfort. "I accept your offer, Great Prince," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the choice I was making. "Though I confess I have no training in dragon customs or royal protocols, and I fear I may embarrass you through ignorance of proper behavior." Valdris's laugh was warmer this time, carrying genuine affection rather than amusement at human limitations. "My son has survived attempts on his life by enemies who sought to eliminate my bloodline, Elena Stormweaver. I think we can manage to forgive minor breaches of etiquette while you learn our ways." The journey to the dragon territories was unlike anything I had experienced, traveling not on foot or horseback, but carried in the gentle grasp of Dragon Prince Valdris himself, soaring above mountains and valleys with perspective that made human concerns seem almost quaint in their limited scope. Below us stretched territories that had been shaped by draconic influence over millennia, where humans and dragons coexisted in wary cooperation that was maintained through mutual respect rather than dominance or submission. The area itself was magnificent, beyond description, carved directly into the living stone of a mountain whose peak pierced the clouds, with chambers that had been polished smooth by generations of dragon fire and decorated with treasures accumulated over centuries. But it was the welcome I received from the other dragons that truly surprised me, treated not as inferior or temporary guest, but as honored member of a household that had been desperate to recover the child I had saved. Over the following months, I learned to navigate the complex social structures of dragon society, to understand the difference between formal protocol and genuine relationship, and most importantly, to help young Theron process the trauma of his kidnapping while teaching him that not all humans were enemies to be feared or dominated. My healing skills found new applications in treating injuries unique to draconic physiology, working with ancient magic that responded to compassion rather than mere technical knowledge. And I discovered that the modest abilities I had always possessed were actually rare gifts when properly developed and channeled. But it was the relationship with Valdris himself that truly transformed my understanding of what was possible between beings from such different worlds. The grief-stricken father, who had threatened entire villages in his desperate search for his son, gradually revealed himself as someone whose power was matched by wisdom, whose authority was tempered by genuine desire to protect those weaker than himself, and whose loneliness as a widowed single parent resonated with my own isolation as a healer who had never quite fit into conventional human society. Our conversations during long evenings, while Theron slept nearby, ranged from practical matters of governance to philosophical discussions about the nature of strength and the obligations that came with power, and I found myself drawn to someone whose perspective on the world challenged everything I thought I understood about leadership and responsibility. It was Theron who first noticed what was developing between his father and myself, commenting with the blunt honesty that only children possessed that Valdris smiled more when I was present, and that I stopped looking sad whenever the Dragon Prince entered a room. The observation had sent embarrassed heat flooding through me, but it had also forced acknowledgement of feelings I had been trying to ignore, attraction that seemed impossible given the vast differences in our nature, species, and station, but that grew stronger with each passing day, despite every logical reason why such connection made no sense. 6 months after that first meeting in Winterhaven Square, Dragon Prince Valdris asked me to walk with him along the mountain paths that wound around the Eyrie, paths that offered privacy for conversations that couldn't be conducted in the presence of curious hatchlings or political advisors who might misinterpret what they witnessed. "Elena," he said when we had reached a promontory that overlooked valleys stretching to the horizon, "there is something I must discuss with you, though I fear the conversation may complicate what has become the most valuable friendship of my long existence." My heart began racing with mixture of hope and terror as I sensed what might be coming, emotions too complex for simple naming warring in my chest. "You saved my son's life 6 months ago," Valdris continued, his massive form somehow managing to convey vulnerability despite power that could reshape landscapes. "In doing so, you gave me back reasons to continue existing beyond mere obligation to my responsibilities, but you have also become something far more significant than the healer I invited into my household, or even the trusted advisor whose counsel helps me navigate challenges I once faced alone." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried emotion that seemed almost painful for such a powerful being to express. "I find myself drawn to you in ways that transcend gratitude or friendship, Elena. Your compassion complements my strength. Your gentle wisdom balances my aggressive protection of those I love, and your presence has transformed my lonely existence into something that feels like genuine partnership rather than merely co-parenting my son." The confession should have shocked me, should have sent me retreating with protests about impossibility and inappropriate feelings. But instead I found myself moving closer to the dragon, whose friendship had become the foundation of my new life. "I feel the same way," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the mountain silence. Which terrifies me because I don't understand how such connection is even possible between beings so fundamentally different. Valdris's laugh was soft and somehow intimate, despite the profound differences in our size and nature. Love has never required that lovers be identical, Elena. It only requires that they see value in each other that transcends surface differences and choose to build something together that neither could create alone. The word love sent shivers through my entire body, naming what I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. And when Valdris carefully extended one massive claw for me to grasp with my comparatively tiny hand, I felt the rightness of connection that had been growing between us since that first meeting. The courtship that followed was unlike anything in dragon or human tradition, requiring us to invent customs that honored both our natures while creating something entirely new. But it was also the most natural relationship either of us had ever experienced, built on foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that had been tested through crisis and proven stronger than differences that should have made partnership impossible. Theron's reaction to learning that his father and I were forming a romantic bond was characteristically direct and enthusiastic, announcing to anyone who would listen that he would finally have the mother he had been hoping for, since understanding that most young creatures had two parents rather than just one. The declaration had been premature, given that Valdris and I were still navigating early stages of our relationship, but it had also been sweetly accurate in capturing what was developing between the three of us. Not just romance between two adults, but family unit being formed through choice, rather than biology or social obligation. 1 year after I had found a dying hatchling in a mountain storm, I stood before the assembled dragon nobility as Valdris formally announced our bonding, a ceremony that blended human and draconic traditions while creating something entirely unique that celebrated the improbable love between beings who should never have connected, but who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful bonds are those that transcend every logical reason why they shouldn't exist. The traveling healer, who had possessed nothing but modest abilities and determination to ease suffering wherever she encountered it, had somehow become mate to Dragon Prince, mother to the heir of ancient bloodline, and bridge between species that had spent centuries in wary coexistence rather than genuine cooperation. And it all began because I couldn't walk past a dying creature without stopping to offer help, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion create the largest transformations, and that the most extraordinary destinies often start with simple choice to be kind when no one is watching and nothing requires us to care.